I can't believe this is happening.
There's a moment in every person's life when they question their worth. For me, it came when the one person I thought I could always count on, my son, told me I was worthless. The man I had spent decades working for, sacrificing my dreams and my health just to see him succeed, suddenly saw me as nothing more than a failure. He looked me in the eye, with no remorse, and said those words that cut deeper than any wound I had ever known. You're useless. You have no purpose anymore. I thought back to all the sleepless nights, the long hours, and the heartaches I had endured for him. The countless times I put my dreams on hold just to give him everything he ever wanted. I didn't deserve this. I had given him everything, yet here he was telling me I was nothing. At that moment, I could have crumbled. I could have let those words destroy me, just as he wanted. But instead, I chose something else. I chose to prove him wrong. I chose to show him that my worth wasn't tied to his opinion or anyone else's for that matter. I wasn't finished yet. What happened next would change both of our lives forever. I decided to take on a challenge I had always dreamed of but never had the time to pursue: building a vineyard. An old, rundown farm that I could turn into something beautiful. I worked day and night, pouring my heart into it. And when Jason came back, he didn't just see the land I had transformed. He saw something else entirely, the proof that my value was never defined by his cruel words. This is the story of how I took back my life and my worth one step at a time. Stay tuned. George had always been a man of hard work and quiet resilience. Raised in a small rural town, his life had never been easy, but it had always been purposeful. His parents, humble farmers themselves, had instilled in him the importance of sacrifice, perseverance, and the value of a good day's work. From a young age, George understood that success wasn't handed to anyone. It had to be earned, one step at a time. As a boy, he spent long hours in the fields, watching his father toil under the harsh sun, his hands rough and calloused from years of labor. He knew what it meant to work for everything: food on the table, a roof over your head, and the opportunity for a better future. George had learned early that hard work was the key to survival and the foundation for his future. When he became a father, George vowed to give his son, Jason, the life he never had. He worked tirelessly in a local factory, pulling long shifts and often sacrificing sleep, comfort, and even his health. For years, he worked 2 jobs just to ensure that Jason had everything he needed, even if it meant putting his own dreams on hold. A simple life was all George ever wanted for his family, but he didn't want Jason to experience the same limitations he had faced. So, he worked harder, dreamed bigger, and did everything in his power to provide the best for his son. But despite all of George's efforts, there was a growing distance between them. The more George worked, the less time he had to spend with Jason. He wasn't home as much as he would have liked, and as Jason grew older, their relationship began to deteriorate. George had hoped that his sacrifices would one day be understood, but he was too busy to notice the subtle shift in his son's heart. Jason became more distant, more rebellious, and less appreciative of the hard work his father put in. The home that George had worked so hard to create was slowly becoming a place of tension and frustration. The walls that once echoed with laughter now felt cold, distant, as though no one truly understood the sacrifices that had been made to keep it all together. George's heart ached as he watched Jason grow older, feeling more like a stranger than a son. At first, George tried to brush off the signs. He told himself that it was just a phase, that his son would come around eventually. But the cracks in their relationship continued to grow, and before long, George realized that the distance between them was no longer something that could be ignored. He began to wonder if all his sacrifices had been in vain. If Jason didn't appreciate him, then what was the point of all the hard work? George had given his life to provide for him, but it seemed like nothing he did was enough. And then came the day that changed everything. It was a regular evening, or so George thought. He had just come home from another long day at work, his back sore and his mind exhausted. He was looking forward to a quiet night, a simple meal with his family, when Jason came into the living room, his face etched with frustration. The moment George saw the look in his son's eyes, he knew something was wrong. He had seen that look before, the look of someone who was angry, hurt, or feeling misunderstood. Jason didn't waste any time. Without warning, he said the words that would haunt George for the rest of his life. You're worthless. You've never done anything but work. You don't have any purpose anymore. All you do is give orders, tell me what to do, and expect me to fall in line like everyone else. I'm tired of it. The words hit George like a physical blow. He stood there in stunned silence, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just been said. How could Jason, the boy he had raised, the boy he had sacrificed everything for, say something like that? How had their relationship gotten to this point? Jason's words weren't just an insult. They were a rejection of everything George had ever believed about family, sacrifice, and love. They were a harsh reminder that, despite all his efforts, George had failed to connect with his son in the way he had hoped. For years, he had been so focused on providing, on securing a future for them, that he had neglected the most important thing of all, their relationship. And now, in this moment of utter betrayal, it seemed that all his hard work had been for nothing. As George stood there, the weight of his son's words sinking in, a flood of emotions overwhelmed him. Anger, confusion, sadness, all mixed together into a thick, suffocating cloud. He wanted to yell, to tell Jason how much he had sacrificed for him, how much he had given up. But he didn't. Instead, he just stood there, frozen in place, unable to find the words. Jason, sensing the tension in the room, turned and walked out without another word. He slammed the door behind him, leaving George standing alone in the silence. For the first time in a long time, George was left to confront his own worth, and it wasn't easy. He thought about the years of hard work, the hours he had poured into providing for his family, the hopes he had carried for Jason's future. Was it all worth it? Had he done the right thing? Could he ever fix the damage that had been done? In the days that followed, George wrestled with these questions, replaying that moment over and over in his mind. He couldn't understand why Jason had turned on him so suddenly. But more than that, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missing all along. Somewhere between the long shifts and the endless to-do lists, he had lost himself. He had lost his sense of purpose. And that's when it hit him. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove his worth through his work, through his sacrifices for others, that he had forgotten what it meant to do something for himself. George had spent decades building a life for his family, but in doing so, he had neglected his own dreams, his own desires. Now, more than ever, he needed something to prove to himself that he was still capable, still worthy. That's when George made a decision that would change everything. He was going to prove to himself and to Jason that his worth wasn't defined by anyone else's opinion. He wasn't finished yet, and that's how George began the journey of turning an old, abandoned farm into a thriving vineyard, a project that would become the very symbol of his self-worth, a testament to the strength he had always had inside him but had never fully acknowledged. This was his moment to rediscover who he was outside of his role as a father, a worker, a provider. He was George, a man capable of creating something beautiful, something meaningful. And he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all his own son, tell him he wasn't worthy. As the days passed after that heart-wrenching confrontation with Jason, George found himself in a quiet storm of internal conflict. The words Jason had spoken echoed relentlessly in his mind, constantly reminding him of his failure as a father. He had always believed that family was everything, that the sacrifices he made would eventually lead to respect and appreciation. But now all of that seemed so hollow. What was the point of working endlessly if it meant he had lost touch with the very people he had worked so hard for? What was the point of doing everything for Jason if Jason no longer saw the value in him? The emotional wound was deep, but it wasn't just about the insult. It was about the entire relationship, how it had deteriorated over the years. The love that had once been so strong between them now felt strained, brittle, like a thread hanging by a mere strand. Jason's words had forced George to face the truth he had been avoiding for far too long. His son no longer respected him, and maybe, just maybe, he never had. For weeks, George struggled to find clarity. He questioned his decisions, the way he had lived his life, and whether all his sacrifices had been in vain. He had spent so many years focused on providing for his family, working multiple jobs, and staying late at the factory, that he had neglected the very essence of what it meant to be a father. He had been so caught up in trying to secure a future for Jason that he had overlooked the need to nurture their relationship. George had failed to see how much time had slipped away, how the simple moments of connection, of real father-son bonding, had been lost in the endless cycle of work, bills, and responsibilities. At the same time, the realization was beginning to settle in that he couldn't undo the past. The damage had been done. No amount of regret could change what had already happened, and that sense of powerlessness gnawed at George's insides. His mind oscillated between fury and guilt. How could Jason be so cruel, so ungrateful? And yet, how could George have been so blind to the emotional disconnect growing between them? He began to wonder if this was all his fault. Had he pushed Jason away with his relentless pursuit of work? Was his son's bitterness a result of neglect? Or was there something deeper, something about Jason's own journey that George had never fully understood? Meanwhile, Jason seemed to distance himself even further. He stopped answering George's calls, barely acknowledged him when they crossed paths, and made it clear in subtle ways that he no longer wanted to be part of George's life. The house that had once been filled with the sounds of Jason's laughter and chatter now felt eerily silent. It was as if George was living in a home with a stranger, not the son he had raised. Every conversation felt forced, shallow, and every attempt at connection was met with rejection. George was consumed by the thought of losing his son completely. He had always known that raising a child was no easy feat, but the stakes had never been so high. He felt the weight of his father's legacy, the legacy of hard work, sacrifice, and quiet pride, pressing on his chest. His father had always taught him that you had to keep going, that you couldn't stop no matter the struggle. But now George felt lost. What was he supposed to do when the one person he had worked his entire life for no longer believed in him? And that's when he began to turn inward. It was during this period of emotional turmoil that George realized something important. He was not going to sit back and let Jason's words define him. He could not change how Jason felt, but he could change how he felt about himself. The decision hit him like a lightning bolt. He was going to take control of his own narrative. No longer would he let his worth be determined by anyone else's approval. Not Jason's. Not anyone's. George wasn't ready to give up on his son, but he also wasn't going to wait for Jason's validation to live the life he deserved. George decided to embark on a new journey, one that was entirely his own. He would pursue the dream he had abandoned so many years ago. He would turn the old farm, a place that had been sitting and used for far too long, into a vineyard. The idea had always been in the back of his mind, something he had quietly longed for but never had the time or resources to chase. The farm had been a part of his family for generations, but it had been left to decay as George focused on providing for his son and keeping the family afloat. But now George saw it differently. The farm was no longer just a symbol of his sacrifices. It was his opportunity to reclaim his own identity. It was time for him to build something from scratch, something that was entirely his. A vineyard. It would require hard work, sweat, and dedication. But George knew that if he could transform this piece of land, he would prove to himself that his worth was never tied to anyone else's perception of him. At the same time, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. The farm was in rough shape. The soil was dry, the barn was falling apart, and the land had not been cared for in years. It would take more than just physical labor. It would take emotional strength. George had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. But that was the point. This was his way of showing not only Jason, but also himself, that he still had the power to create something beautiful, something worthwhile, despite everything that had happened. George started with the basics, rebuilding the land. Every morning before sunrise, he would step out onto the property, his hands calloused and rough from years of manual labor. He didn't mind the work. It felt cathartic. Each shovel of dirt he dug, every vine he planted, was a reminder that he could still take control of his life. As the days passed, the vineyard began to take shape. The soil was enriched, the barn slowly repaired, and the vines began to grow. The deeper George dug into the soil, the more he felt himself digging out the emotional weight that had been buried inside him for so long. He was reclaiming his worth with each step. Yet, there was still a shadow looming over him, Jason. Every evening, after long hours of hard work, George would wonder if his son would ever see the vineyard, ever understand what it meant. Would he ever be able to see beyond his anger and regret? George knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that some battles were worth fighting, even if it meant fighting alone. This vineyard wasn't just about growing grapes. It was about growing George. It was a symbolic rebirth, a personal challenge to find his strength again. No longer would he allow anyone's words, especially his own son's, to determine his worth. And so, the conflict raged on within him. The struggle for redemption was not just a battle for his son's approval. It was a battle for his own sense of self. He had to prove that he was more than just a provider, more than just a father. He was a man capable of creating something beautiful from nothing. But with each passing day, George knew that the road to reconciliation would be just as difficult as the road to redemption. Would Jason ever understand? Would he ever come back to see what his father had built? Time would tell. As George worked tirelessly on the vineyard, a sense of accomplishment began to settle into his bones. The hard labor was invigorating, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of control over something that mattered. The land, once overrun with weeds and decay, was beginning to show signs of life. Every morning, he would stand at the edge of the property and look out over the rows of vines, imagining the future, the dream he had long put on hold. It was as if he had a new purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. But as much as he poured his heart into the vineyard, Jason's absence loomed like a shadow over his every step. The farm had always been a symbol of family, of everything he had worked for. To see it coming to life in a way he had always imagined should have been a victory. Yet without Jason by his side, it felt incomplete. The dream, though fulfilling in its own right, lacked the one person it was meant to be shared with. Jason was the reason George had pushed so hard for so many years. He was supposed to be a part of this, not a distant figure in George's memory. The pain of their fractured relationship became more evident each day. It wasn't just that Jason had walked away, it was the deep sense of abandonment that accompanied it. George had always thought that family was something that would remain constant, that no matter what, there would always be someone by your side, especially your children. But Jason's words, his rejection, shattered that illusion. For the first time, George had to confront the reality that the bond he had worked so hard to build with his son might be beyond repair. As the vineyard grew, so did George's feelings of isolation. He worked the land alone, and when the day ended, he returned to an empty house. The silence was deafening. There was no laughter, no chatter, no sign of the boy he had raised. The emptiness weighed on him, not just in the physical absence of Jason, but in the absence of any emotional connection. George had tried calling Jason, reaching out in small ways, but each time, his attempts were met with cold silence. Jason didn't want to hear from him, and the hurt of that reality was a constant reminder of how far they had drifted. George began to wonder if there was any way to fix it. Could the vineyard, this symbol of his perseverance and self-worth, somehow become the bridge that would bring him and Jason back together? Or was the damage done irreparable beyond the point of healing? One afternoon, while working in the vineyard, George received a call from a local supplier. The man was offering some advice about the best types of grapes to grow on the land, something George was still learning about. The call was brief, but the voice on the other end of the line sounded so familiar. It was Jason's old high school friend, the one George had often seen around when Jason was younger. The voice brought a rush of memories, and for a moment, George allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was a sign that things could change. But as soon as he hung up, reality settled back in. The call had been a brief exchange of pleasantries, and nothing more. Jason's friend was just another reminder of a life George had once had, of the family that had once felt so whole, and yet now felt fractured beyond recognition. George had hoped, even for just a second, that someone who had known Jason in his younger years might offer a hint of insight into what had gone wrong. But there was nothing, no real answers, no closure. Just another piece of the puzzle that seemed too complicated to solve. As the days wore on, George found himself sinking deeper into the emotional quagmire. The work on the vineyard continued, but it no longer brought the same joy it once had. It was still fulfilling to see the land transform, but with each passing day, it felt like the vineyard was becoming a symbol of his isolation, a place where all his efforts had gone, but where no one could truly share in the victory. What hurt most was the realization that George couldn't control what Jason thought or felt. All the time he had spent working for a future he thought they would share was now in vain. The vineyard could not heal the emotional wounds that ran deep between them. The truth was, George had no idea what to do next. He didn't want to give up on his son, but he also couldn't force him to come back. Jason's rejection felt final, and each attempt George made to rebuild their bond only seemed to push him further away. George sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the rows of vines, his mind swirling with confusion and grief. He thought about all the things he wanted to say to Jason. He wanted to tell him that he was sorry, even though he wasn't entirely sure what for. He wanted to explain how much he had tried, how much he had sacrificed to give Jason the life he thought he deserved. He wanted to tell him that even though things had gone wrong, there was still a chance to fix it. But the words never came. The conflict deepened as George continued to grapple with his emotions. He couldn't let go of the hope that things would get better, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the reality that Jason's rejection was something he might never be able to change. Each day, the weight of it pressed on him more. He felt torn between the dream of reconciliation and the painful truth that sometimes, despite our best efforts, relationships don't always work out the way we hope. And that thought, the thought that he might never have a meaningful relationship with his son again, felt like a wound that would never heal. In the quiet of the evening, with the vineyard spread out before him, George came to a grim conclusion. He had no control over Jason's actions. He could only control his own. And though he couldn't fix their relationship right now, he could continue to build the vineyard, to keep working, and to keep proving to himself that his worth wasn't defined by anyone else's approval, least of all his son's. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was the only one that offered him any semblance of peace. The vineyard was his, and it was something he could hold on to, something that would stand as a testament to his strength. Even if Jason never returned, George would be okay. The emotional toll of it all was heavy, but it wasn't over yet. There was more to come, more challenges, more moments of doubt. And yet, George knew that his journey of rebuilding himself wasn't just about the vineyard or even about Jason. It was about finding a way to move forward, no matter how hard it might be. The days seemed to blur together as George continued his work on the vineyard. Each passing week brought fresh challenges, and while the land transformed under his efforts, the emotional burden he carried remained just as heavy. The vineyard, which once symbolized a hopeful new beginning, now felt like a constant reminder of his fractured relationship with Jason. George had poured his heart into this dream, but every milestone felt bittersweet without the one person he had envisioned sharing it with. His thoughts frequently wandered to Jason. Was he out there, living his life completely oblivious to everything George had sacrificed? Or was he too angry to care? The conflict between them only deepened with each passing day. George's attempts at reconciliation had been met with cold silence. The phone calls, the text messages, the visits to Jason's apartment, they all ended the same way, with no response. Jason had completely shut him out. George couldn't understand it. Hadn't he done enough? He had spent years putting Jason's needs above his own, working to create a future for him, and now, nothing seemed to matter. Jason's rejection felt like an insurmountable wall that George couldn't break down. The weight of Jason's absence pressed on him, and the frustration of not being able to repair their relationship felt suffocating. It wasn't just about the vineyard anymore. It was about the life he had built, the family he had hoped to share it with, and the person he had hoped Jason would become. How had things gone so wrong? What had he missed? As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jason's friend. the same one George had spoken to a few weeks ago. The message was brief and to the point. Jason's coming to visit this weekend. He wants to see the vineyard. George's heart skipped a beat. After weeks of silence, Jason was coming. The idea of seeing him again stirred a mix of emotions: excitement, hope, fear. What had changed? Why had Jason decided to come now? Was it a sign of reconciliation, or just another passing moment that would lead to more disappointment? The emotions that bubbled up inside George were overwhelming. On one hand, he felt a rush of hope. Maybe this was his chance to finally reach his son, to show him the work he had done, to prove that he wasn't worthless. But there was also a deep fear. What if Jason came only to tear him down again? What if the distance between them was so vast that even the vineyard, the symbol of George's perseverance and love, couldn't bridge it? The days leading up to Jason's visit were filled with anticipation, but also dread. George spent hours cleaning the vineyard, making sure everything was perfect. He wanted to show Jason how much he had accomplished, how far he had come, not just in terms of the land, but in terms of himself. This wasn't just about the vines or the harvest. It was about showing Jason that his father was more than the man he had insulted. He was a man who had strength, resilience, and, most importantly, self-worth. George knew he had to be strong, even if he was terrified of what Jason might say or do. Jason arrived shortly after noon. He stepped out of his car, his face unreadable. He looked different, older, more worn, as though time had taken a toll on him, just as it had on George. There was a long pause as father and son stood facing each other, neither knowing where to start. George opened his mouth to speak, but the words got caught in his throat. How could he fix this? How could he undo the damage that had been done? And then, one fateful evening, everything came to a head. It was nearing harvest season, and the vineyard was beginning to show the fruits of their labor, literally and metaphorically. George was standing at the edge of the field, looking out over the rows of vines, a quiet sense of pride swelling in his chest. This was his doing. Every vine, every grape, every drop of sweat that had soaked into the soil was a testament to his strength and determination. But as he stood there, something gnawed at him. Jason had been distant for days. He had shown up less frequently, his visits becoming more infrequent, his conversations more strained. As he stood in the vineyard that evening, Jason's car pulled up to the gravel drive, the engine humming softly in the cool twilight air. Jason got out of the car slowly, his shoulders hunched, his gaze averted. George tried to catch his eye, but Jason kept his focus on the ground, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Jason," George called out, his voice cautious but steady. Jason paused, then turned to face him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," George continued, trying to steady his voice, "about the vineyard, about us, about what we still need to say." Jason shifted his weight, but he didn't respond right away. The silence between them grew heavier, more suffocating. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice low and heavy with something George couldn't quite place. "Dad, I don't know if this is what I want. I appreciate everything you've done for me. I really do. But this vineyard, this whole thing, it's not me. It's not what I want." George's heart stopped for a moment, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He felt the familiar wave of frustration, of fear, rising inside him. "What are you saying?" George asked, struggling to keep his voice from cracking. "We've come so far. I've worked so hard to build this, and you." Jason cut him off, his words coming fast, as though he couldn't hold them back anymore. "I never asked for this, Dad. You keep talking about what we built, but it's not what I want. It never was. I didn't need a vineyard. I needed you." George stood frozen, his chest tightening as Jason's words hit him harder than anything he had expected. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of confusion and hurt. "I've given you everything. Everything I did was for you. I thought you'd be proud of what we've built." Jason's eyes finally met George's, but there was no warmth in them, only a coldness that felt like a razor blade. "I didn't ask you to build something for me, Dad. I didn't ask you to work yourself to the bone for years just to build something you thought I'd like. I just wanted you. Jason's words stung, but there was a revelation buried in them, one that George couldn't ignore. The vineyard wasn't the problem. The problem was their connection, their ability to communicate, to truly understand each other's needs. Jason needed his father, not a vineyard. He needed the man who had been so busy working that he had forgotten how to be present. Jason took a step back, his face filled with frustration and pain. I can't keep doing this, Dad. I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not. His voice cracked, betraying the vulnerability that lay beneath the anger. I need to figure out who I am. I need to do it without you constantly reminding me of what I should want. The words hit George like a tidal wave. He had always believed that love and sacrifice were enough to make things right. But now, as he stood in the vineyard, he realized that love alone wasn't enough if it wasn't paired with understanding, with presence, and with real connection. He had been so blinded by his own sense of failure that he had failed to see what Jason truly needed: his time, his support, and his unconditional love. Not just a vineyard. Jason turned to leave, but George stepped forward, his heart racing. "Wait," he called out, his voice desperate. "Please, don't walk away again." Jason paused, but didn't turn around. "I need space, Dad. I need to figure this out on my own. I need you to understand that I can't live in your shadow anymore." And just like that, the words that George had feared the most, those painful, final words, hung in the air between them. The silence between them felt like an eternity, each second stretching into what seemed like hours. George's chest tightened, his breath shallow as he processed the finality in Jason's words. The reality of what had just been said began to sink in like cold water, and George felt as if the very foundation of everything he had worked for, his family, his dreams, his sense of self-worth, was crumbling around him. Jason didn't turn to face him. He just stood there, his back turned, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily in the space between them. It was as if George's entire life, all his sacrifices, everything he had built with his own two hands, had been reduced to nothing more than a distant dream that no longer mattered. For a moment, George felt completely paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of loss. He had done everything for this moment, and yet here he was, standing on the precipice of losing everything. But then something stirred inside George. It wasn't just pain or fear anymore. It was something deeper, a realization that he couldn't let this be the end. He couldn't let Jason slip away without fighting for what they still had left. Not everything was lost. Not yet. He took a step forward, his voice softer this time, filled with something other than desperation. "Jason, I can't change what I've done. I can't take back the years I spent working, trying to provide for you. But I can't just let you walk away thinking I don't care. I do care. I've always cared, and I'm sorry that I've never shown you that in the way you needed." Jason didn't move. He was still facing away, and George could see the stiff set of his son's shoulders, the way his fists were clenched. Jason wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet, but George had to say it. He needed Jason to understand, even if it was hard for both of them. "I've spent so many years focused on giving you things, thinking that was enough," George continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I see now that I missed the point. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but in doing that, I lost sight of what you needed most. I've been selfish, Jason. I've been so caught up in providing that I never stopped to listen, to be there for you the way you needed." George took another step closer, the words tumbling out, his heart beating louder in his chest. "I was wrong, Jason. I was so caught up in trying to be perfect for you that I forgot what really mattered. You're right. I've been in my own world, and I've been blind to yours. But I'm asking you, please, don't give up on me. Don't give up on us." Jason stood still, the tension in his body palpable. But there was something in his stance that made George feel like he wasn't entirely lost. There was a flicker of something, regret, understanding, maybe even hope. But it was buried under layers of anger, confusion, and years of unspoken pain. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad," Jason said quietly, his voice low, raw. "I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I used to. All these years, I thought I was just another thing you had to provide for, another thing on your to-do list. I felt like I was invisible to you. You were so busy working that I stopped thinking you'd ever see me for who I really am." George's heart clenched. He had never realized the extent of Jason's pain, the deep well of hurt that his son had been carrying all these years. Jason's words weren't just a reflection of the past. They were a window into a relationship that had been damaged so thoroughly that both of them had lost sight of the path back to one another. Jason didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, George feared that the door to reconciliation had closed forever. But then, slowly, Jason stepped closer, his shoulders relaxed, his face softened. He didn't say anything at first, but the space between them felt different now. The walls that had kept them apart for so long were finally beginning to crumble, piece by piece. "I don't know what that looks like, Dad," Jason said softly. "I don't know how we fix this, but I'm willing to try, too. I'm willing to try." The words were simple, but they held more meaning than George could ever have imagined. For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw a glimmer of hope in Jason's eyes. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild something that both of them had thought was lost forever. As father and son stood in the vineyard, the quiet evening settling around them, George felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of a future together. The past might have been filled with mistakes and regrets, but the future was still unwritten. And for the first time in a long time, George believed that they could write it together. In that moment, it wasn't about the vineyard. It wasn't about the work, the sacrifices, or the things that had defined their relationship up until now. It was about the connection between them, the bond that had never truly disappeared, even through the pain, the silence, and the distance. And for the first time, George realized that the greatest harvest of all wasn't on the vines. It was in the love and understanding they were beginning to grow again, one step at a time. The days following their conversation were marked by small, significant shifts. George and Jason didn't have a magic moment where everything was suddenly perfect. There was no grand, dramatic transformation, no instant fix to the years of hurt and miscommunication. But there was something else, something just as powerful, a quiet, slow rebuilding of trust, an effort from both sides to truly understand and support one another in ways they hadn't before. Jason didn't return to the vineyard every day, but he did begin showing up more often. At first, it was just to talk, casual conversations about the farm, about life, about the things they used to share before everything had become so complicated. Slowly, Jason started to engage more with the work. He learned about the soil, the different grape varieties, and the subtle art of winemaking. His interest wasn't driven by duty, nor was it a desire to simply appease George. It was more than that. Jason began to see the vineyard not as just his father's project, but as something that was part of their shared history, something they could both contribute to together. The tension between them had lifted, but it wasn't gone completely. There were still moments where old wounds would flare up, where George would feel the sting of past mistakes, and where Jason would retreat into himself, unwilling to fully open up. But for the first time, both of them understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about being willing to move forward, to accept the imperfections, and to keep trying even when it felt hard. Every visit Jason made to the vineyard, every conversation they had, was a small victory. It was a step toward something that could be rebuilt, not perfectly, but honestly. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, George and Jason found themselves sitting on the porch of the old farmhouse, looking out over the vines. It had been a particularly long day of pruning and sorting through the ripened grapes. They were both tired, but the exhaustion was different this time. It was the kind that came from real work, from shared effort. There was a comfort in the silence between them now, a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. For the first time in a long time, they were simply together, without the weight of unspoken words hanging over them. George looked over at Jason, watching the way the sunset illuminated his son's face, the shadows casting soft lines of reflection. The old feeling of pride surged in him again. It wasn't because of the vineyard or the work they'd done. It was because Jason was there. He was present, and so was George. They were together, sharing this moment, despite all the pain and distance that had come before. It was something simple, yet profound. George said quietly, breaking the silence, I never really understood until now what it meant to be here, to be present. I spent so much time thinking that I had to build something, to prove something, but I never stopped to realize that the most important thing was just being with you. Jason glanced over at him, his expression thoughtful. I get that now, too. I spent so much time resenting you for what I thought you didn't give me, but I never saw how hard you were working. I didn't see what you were trying to give me in your own way. I guess I was just too hurt to see it. George nodded, understanding more than words could express. I was so focused on giving you everything I thought you wanted that I lost sight of the most important thing, just being your dad. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure that out. Jason didn't say anything at first. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze returning to the vineyard before them. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice softer than before. It's not about the vineyard, Dad. I mean, this place is great, but it's not what matters most. It's about us, about you and me, about being here together. A smile tugged at the corners of George's lips. It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment of reconciliation, but it was real. It was exactly what he had been hoping for. He could feel the connection between them, not in the flashy moments of success or accomplishment, but in the quiet, everyday exchanges, the work they did side by side, the conversations they shared, the understanding they were beginning to rebuild. It was about the simple, unspoken truths that finally started to come to the surface. They were both learning how to be present for one another, not just physically, but emotionally. For the first time in years, George allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. The vineyard had started as a project to prove his worth, to prove that he could still do something meaningful. But now, it had become a symbol of something else, of his commitment to his son, of their shared journey, and of the healing that had begun. The land, once a place of isolation, had now become a space of connection. It was a physical reminder of how much they had both grown. The next few months brought steady progress. The vineyard flourished, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional depth that George had never anticipated. With each harvest, they celebrated not just the fruits of their labor, but the fruits of their relationship. Slowly but surely, they had found their way back to one another. As they prepared to bottle the first batch of wine from the vineyard, George and Jason stood together in the winery, their hands covered in the dark purple stain of freshly picked grapes. Jason turned to George, a small but genuine smile on his face. You know, this is pretty amazing. We actually did it, Dad. Together. George smiled back, his heart full, knowing that the true harvest of this journey wasn't just the grapes. It was the restoration of a relationship that had seemed lost. Yeah, we did. And we're going to keep doing it, one step at a time. The vineyard was a place of new beginnings, not just for the land, but for both of them. The past would always be a part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They had built something together, not just with their hands, but with their hearts. And that, George realized, was what truly mattered. Have you ever found yourself struggling to rebuild a broken relationship, whether with family, friends, or even yourself? What steps did you take to move past the pain and start anew? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you navigated through your own challenges and found healing. Rebuilding a relationship is never easy. It takes time, patience, and most importantly, a willingness to acknowledge the mistakes of the past and work towards a better future. If you're in a similar situation, whether it's with your parents, your children, or someone else important to you, remember, it's never too late to start over. No matter how many years have passed, the first step to healing is simply showing up, being present, and having the courage to communicate. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring content about growth, healing, and the power of second chances. There's always hope, and there's always room for change. If you're looking for more stories that inspire change in relationships and self-discovery, hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Also, if you think someone you know could benefit from this story, share it with them. Sometimes, we all need a reminder that it's never too late to rebuild what we thought was lost. Thanks for watching, and remember, healing takes time, but every step you take towards understanding is a step toward a stronger, more connected future. Keep growing, keep learning, and keep believing in the power of transformation.